Stay tuned for a Democracy Day special. Hello, everybody, listening to WPPM, People Powered Media, here live from PhillyCAM Center City Studios. I'm Vanessa Maria Graber. And on today is Democracy Day. And on today's show, we are going to be talking about the current threats to democracy. Democracy Day is a campaign sponsored by the Center for Cooperative Media. And so PhillyCAM's chosen to participate by creating some content. Let me tell you a little bit about the campaign and the problem with democracy being under threat today. And then I'll introduce my panelists. We're currently facing an unrelenting assault on our democracy, a clear and present threat to our constitutional rights and our ability as journalists to exist and do our jobs. But as we inch closer to a possible democratic collapse in 2024, the magnitude of that threat isn't well understood by all Americans, nor is it being treated seriously enough by our elected officials. In some cases, elected officials are part of the anti-democratic efforts and aren't being held accountable. It's time for journalists like us here at WPPM to step up and do more. The goal of Democracy Day is to draw attention to this crisis, provide the public with the context and information they need, and bring all types of media together to sound the alarm collectively. So today's the day, September 15th, when media on the national and local level come together to report on the threat that we're facing. And this includes original reporting, aggregations of existing reporting, op-eds, and discussion about the current threats to democracy. And so today we are going to be talking with two guests who are regulars here on PhillyCAM on the show Hall Monitor. We regularly cover local government and also state and national government. And we're going to be talking about First Amendment, election and voting rights, white supremacist organizing, and disinformation, and how all those things are current threats to our democratic institutions and democracy at large. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on Larry and Denise.
Thank you for having us.
Hello, welcome to the show. Larry Mcglynn is a journalist and the host and founder, co-founder of one of the shows that we love here on WPPM called Hall Monitor. And he has been covering local government for a really long time. And also we have freelance reporter extraordinaire, Denise Clay-Murray. Denise writes for a number of publications and is a regular fixture and collaborator here at PhillyCAM on the Hall Monitor show and on other programs as well. Welcome both of you to the program.
Thank you for having us.
So I wanted to begin by diving into the First Amendment, right? Without the First Amendment, we wouldn't be here right now. You know, I've visited a number of other countries around the world. Most recently, I've been to Cuba, where their media systems are not the same as ours. And so here in the United States, we are protected by the First Amendment in our Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, which talks about our freedom of speech, our freedom of assembly, and also, you know, our freedom of the press and freedom of religion. It's the reason why so many people from all around the world have flocked to the United States. And it's the reason why we're able to bring you this program today to talk about all these issues. Denise, this is a really important topic for you. And in an earlier conversation, you mentioned that many Americans don't quite understand the First Amendment, but more importantly, they're not taking advantage of all the rights afforded to them under the law. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you all for taking the time to listen to this. The first thing that we need to remember about the First Amendment is that it was not part of the original Constitution. It was the First Amendment to it. But when the founding fathers put together the Constitution, they didn't take freedom of speech into consideration until somebody said, hey, you need to take freedom of speech into consideration. Now, when I say that people don't utilize all of their rights with the First Amendment as much as they should, it's because part of it is because they don't quite understand what is your right under the First Amendment and what is not. For example, if you go to a city council meeting, which Larry and I go to a lot, Um, you have the right to speak during public comment or at any other time that's been designated for that at a council meeting and say whatever it is you need to say to your government. Your government cannot stop you from talking to them. They cannot stop you from criticizing them. They can't stop you from, basic. If you want to say to if you want to say to City Council President Darrell Clark, I don't like you and I think you're a flubberhead, you're well within your rights to do that. It would be silly and I would probably be laughing in the corner at you, but you have that right. Where people kind of veer off in terms of not knowing what their First Amendment rights are is if you were to go on Twitter, which is a privately owned platform that allows you to speak but has regulations that keep you from saying stuff that's libelous or slanderous, because they can be sued for your speech. It's not a violation of the First Amendment for them to kick you off. That became probably the issue I discussed the most with people when Donald Trump, the former president, lost his Twitter account because he was basically spreading misinformation and sticking his followers on people and doing things like that. The folks at Twitter do not have to put up with that, because they don't have to allow you to get them sued for that. And another way, particularly with communities of color, and this is something that came up to me the most during the George Floyd protests, you don't have to ask your government for permission to speak. If you want to start a march down a public street, that is your right. You don't have to get a permit for it. You don't got to get permission for it. You don't have to ask nicely. It's your street. You can have a protest if you want. You don't need to ask anyone's permission. And I think I think that sometimes we as citizens don't realize that that is our right. That you have the right to say to the police when they ask you for ID at a protest, no, I don't have to give you that information. You have the right, and this is a right that I've had to exercise more than once, to say, I am a member of the press. And because I'm a member of the press and I am covering this, you can't kick me out. You can't keep me from interviewing people, because my job, which is one of the few jobs that we have in this country that's constitutionally protected, that you don't have to run for election to, says I can do that. And Vanessa, just one more quick thing. What you mentioned that the First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion. I think it's also important for people to know that it guarantees freedom from religion, meaning that you're not mandated to subscribe to any one religion by your government. And if somebody tries to tell you something like, oh, we're a Christian nation and Christianity is the only thing that counts, that is incorrect, especially under the First Amendment.
Yes, that's so true. Obviously, there's many people who are escaping religious repression from countries around the world and come here to also exercise those rights. I wanted to talk quickly also about, the right to assemble, right? Protest is a legitimate form of dissent and resistance. And, direct action, nonviolent resistance, in the way of Martin Luther King and many of the tactics used in the civil rights movement also included sit-ins and many other ways that people can express dissatisfaction with corporations, with business owners, and with government. Now, there's different levels to that, but certainly if we're using public spaces, like our sidewalks and public spaces, people have a right to gather, to assemble, to speak, and to express dissent. And there is a tendency to want to collaborate with police and get permits, and maybe sometimes that's necessary, but it's absolutely not required in most cases, unless you're on federal land or on private property. Then obviously different rules apply. And you're also not required to tell the police what you're doing with your rally or where you're going in your march or protest. There is confusion when people are approached by police and they demand to want to know where you're going. And all you need to say to them is the First Amendment allows me to gather and to assemble and express dissent, and I am not required to divulge any further information. They can keep on asking and placing pressure, but it is not illegal to deny them that information. Larry, I wanted to give you a chance to chime in on First Amendment issues. What threats to democracy do you think are associated with the First Amendment and all of these elements under the Bill of Rights as it relates to the First Amendment?
Well, I think Denise, as always, hit it right on the head. My belief is that the First Amendment is the second most misunderstood amendment. And the first is the Second Amendment, which is a whole other discussion. How we interpret that is beyond belief. But the First Amendment, it's one of those things that, like Denise had said, you'll see it on social media where, oh, you're violating my First Amendment right. Well, no one's doing that. That's not what that means. This is a discussion I think we have to have over and over again to define what exactly is the First Amendment and to give people that right idea about what this is. And that's why programs like this and so many other things we do are so important. The First Amendment protects us in a lot of ways, not just as individuals, but as journalists. And Denise also mentioned that journalism is one of the few actual professions mentioned in the Constitution. And there's a reason for that. The Founding Fathers knew there needed to be a check against government that was not of government. And there are a lot of other nations that claim to be democracies that don't have that. Now, you can talk about how the free market, which is anything but, has decimated journalism, created problems, which is why I think you're starting to see the rise of smaller journalism outfits like what we have at Hall Monitor, where we're 3 people on the show, myself, Denise, and Lance Haver, and we have a couple other people who work with us in other capacities. In a strange way, this is kind of a golden age for small news outlets that we're seeing that can focus on very specific things. And you're seeing the larger news outlets start to fall away. We've been seeing that for a while now. And then the question becomes, well, if this right of the press is enshrined in the Constitution, should the government step in? And the answer to that is no. If you have government funds going to the press, it's going to impact the journalism, right? I just think there's no two ways about that. But there has been legislation suggested that would provide funds or tax credits to individuals to subscribe to a different newspaper or outlet, which I think is fine. But when we talk about the First Amendment and we have a very imperfect understanding of what that really means. And it's used a lot to justify hate speech. And it's the kind of thing where I feel like we're kind of chasing our tails a little bit when we're fighting this hate speech and this kind of watershed what we've seen since the first Trump campaign, where it gave what he was doing, gave license to a lot of people just to say whatever they'd been holding back, is what I think it really was. Racist, misogynistic things, and how do you fight back against that, and what do you do? Well, I think what you do is you have events like this on days like this to help keep trying to further define what the First Amendment is and really what our country is.
Yeah, really great points, Larry. I did want to clarify that the government does fund public media, which
Yes.
then in turn
Yeah.
is used to produce journalism. And in New Jersey, we recently passed a civic information bill, which created the Civic Information Consortium. that is a grant-making agency to fund local journalism projects. I
Right,
think
right.
what we're seeing is like kind of these institutions or agencies be an intermediary, so the money is not coming directly from government, but there's like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But I see what you're trying to say. But I do want to acknowledge that there is a local news crisis, right, which is kind of under the umbrella of the First Amendment, even though we have a lot of rights to express ourselves and even build community media infrastructure like PhillyCAM to express diverse points of view and to be able to push back against a lot of the dominant narratives. It really requires capital to do that. And we've seen increasingly over the last 20 years, especially after the passing of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, that there has been a rapid decline of local newspapers, independent media outlets, Black and women owned independent media, and just tens of thousands of journalists being laid off who are no longer able to produce really important news stories that are informing the public. And so it's important that we support policies and movements that are trying to fully fund community media and independent media outlets like ours, but also, to fill the gaps in all of these local news deserts that are happening across the country. Because again, a robust democracy includes a fully informed citizenry. I want to move us along to the next topic, which is hold on, elections and voting rights. Something we're really familiar with. We usually collaborate every year, a couple times a year, on the primaries and the general elections. Of course, we have a midterm election coming up in November at the federal level, which is going to be very important in terms of whether or not the power balance is shifted in favor of Democrats or Republicans. But more importantly, we have local and statewide elections, which often have lower turnouts when there's not a bigger presidential or general election happening. Larry and Denise, I want to give you an opportunity to chime in on things like gerrymandered districts. We're seeing a lot of battles happening in court right now with redistricting and gerrymandered maps that favor one party over another or completely exclude or marginalize Black and Latinx voters. We're also seeing voter ID laws and other voter disenfranchisement happening at the state level. And finally, we're pulling back a lot of the access that was made possible during the pandemic, like mail-in ballots and, being able to vote more easily, or making it harder and harder for folks to vote across the country. And even, on this side of the country, we still don't have things like same-day registration like they do in other states. Can both of you talk about what you're seeing in terms to threats to the rights of voters here in the United States?
Do you want to take that first, Larry, or do you want me to go?
Sure. I mean, in Pennsylvania, you don't have to look any farther than Doug Mastriano, who's running for governor. His whole concept of fair elections is anything but. Again, he's one of these people who was there on January 6th and believes that the 2020 election was stolen when there's no evidence to suggest that was the case. In Philadelphia, before the 2020 election, they gave us a tour of the convention center where all the ballots are going to be processed. I was on that tour, and it's exactly what you would expect. It ran as well as those things can do when you're talking about such a large volume of ballots. But when you have people in elected positions who believe or pretend to believe, now I don't know which is which. With Mastriano, I think he believes that this election was stolen. I think other politicians pretend to believe in order to curry favor. But when you have that kind of mindset by people who have been elected or could be elected, it's a great threat to, how our elections are going to be run and what we're going to be doing in this country and in across all these different states. I think right now that notion of people who believe these strange things taking power is the biggest threat to democracy we've seen in my lifetime.
Right. The candidates themselves running in these elections pose their very own threat, right? And they're using all these mechanisms that I just talked about in order to get elected. Um, and so there's a couple of levels to all of this, right? There's some really scary people organizing and running to get elected. I mean, we saw how many QAnon folks ran in the last election and actually got elected. People who believe a lot of these wild conspiracy theories, and we'll get to disinformation later on in the program. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of people come out of the woodwork who are looking to run very hateful campaigns with a more explicit intention to hate and discriminate against people of color, against the LGBT population, poor people, disabled people, etc. Denise, tell us your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I have never understood how we do redistricting in the first place, because basically you're telling the politicians that they can decide who their voters are going to be rather than the other way around. I don't think politicians should have that right. I think that Pennsylvania should be like other places where an independent entity that isn't connected with either of the parties really decides how these districts should go, and how even they should be, and who, and whether or not there's places where they're majority Black or majority Latinx or majority Asian, where there's power for these folks, where they have their own representation in addition to representation, anywhere else. But what Larry said about Doug Mastriano or some of the other people running is absolutely right. You have people who are not in support of small d democracy, trying to run for office and bring in what their version of that looks like. Among the things that Mastriano is proposing is that everybody be made to register to vote every year. Now, under federal law as well as state law, that is illegal, because the only reason you should have to re-register to vote is if you have moved or you have changed your name or any of those kinds of things. You shouldn't have to re-register to vote just because somebody believes that you being allowed to express your electoral preference is going to somehow cause the republic to fall because it's not in favor of them. And let's just be honest as to why a lot of this is going on. In the year 2000, we had a census. And under that census, it showed that by the year 2025, Spanish was going to be the dominant language in this country. So naturally, people saw that. And because a lot of these folks who are in like white supremacist groups or other groups that have been so used to maintaining their privilege that it's become a big part of who they are, they decided that since this is a zero-sum game, we have to prevent this from happening, which is why you saw changes in immigration law, and you started to hear the rumblings of, oh, we need voter ID, we need this, we need that. And all of that is designed to keep people from fully exercising their right to vote. When that wasn't quite as effective as folks wanted it to be, because a Black dude named Barack Obama ended up becoming president not once but twice, then they had to pull out the big guns. And before there was QAnon, there was the Tea Party, which, if folks didn't catch the racism from the Tea Party, they weren't paying attention. This particular group of people was always around But you had folks like Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and folks like that who said, okay, we're only going to let them out of the basement to vote. In 2009, John Boehner and the Republican Party in the House decided they wanted the House of Representatives so badly that they let them out of the basement. And basically now they are running things. And unfortunately, how that has impacted media is that it has made a lot of folks, particularly on the more mainstream media, afraid of calling a spade a spade. It has made them afraid to call out racism because they're afraid that they're going to get fired, or their company is going to lose advertising and more jobs are going to be cut that way, or any number of things. So, the fact that these folks are running around and they're attempting to make policy is because the stage has been set for them to do that. If you make sure that people either have bad information or no information, they're easier to control. And that's what's been going on here, is because this is the long game. This has actually been going on since 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. It's just come to fruition now.
Yeah, those are really good points, Denise. I want to add that, when I was doing voter outreach in 2020 as a volunteer, right, not affiliated with any campaigns or political parties, we really were just trying to give people basic voting information. Most people did not know very simple things, right? They did not know how to find their polling location. And then when we looked online, the polling locations were linked as Excel spreadsheets with hundreds of locations on there. And people can't look at that on their phones. The mail-in ballot instructions were very murky. It was not clear how they were supposed to download it or get it. Most people don't have printers in their house, so even though they could find the download link, they didn't have the actual paper application. So we did have a number of those, in order to give to people to fill out the application, because again, they don't know that they have to apply for a mail-in ballot in order to receive the actual ballot. Then when the ballots came in Philadelphia, you had to put them in two separate envelopes. Envelope number one, then you had to stuff it in envelope number two. If you didn't do it in that way, your ballot was thrown away. Also, if you applied for a mail-in ballot and then you got to your polling location, you had to bring your mail-in ballot with you. And if you didn't bring it, you were given a provisional ballot. What I'm trying to say is these processes are very difficult for most people, especially people experiencing poverty, right? Like Philadelphia is the largest poorest city in the United States. We have a large population of people experiencing poverty. There's people that have all kinds of other challenges, people who are differently abled. It was very difficult to find transportation to all of these new polling locations for folks who are not able to walk the few blocks that they're normally able to. Obviously, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. There's monkeypox and polio in New York City. People are, especially those who are immunocompromised, they're experiencing anxiety and fear around actually going out to vote and waiting in those long lines. We need to make it easier for people to participate in elections. We need more voter education, and I'm not sure why this isn't really emphasized at colleges and universities. And I feel like most civics classes have been eliminated from high schools as well. There's a lot of young people eligible to vote. They don't know the process. I teach a course at a university. I teach my students how to register to vote in the state of New Jersey. I explain the process because I teach a journalism class, and I think it's important that media, especially mainstream media with their big platforms, right, their huge reach, spend more time educating people on how to vote. They have the resources to do so, and instead we're getting a lot of celebrity infotainment, useless information that's not really serving audiences. Lastly, I'll say that, places like PhillyCAM and Hall Monitor are really doing a good job of filling the gaps when it comes to third-party candidates. judges running for elections, and all of the other offices that people are running for, where the voting public maybe is not super aware of how to choose a judge, how to work with the Bar Association, and find out how to evaluate the candidates. The ballot questions are still very confusing to people. They're not necessarily available in all different languages. And so, again, there just needs to be so much more political education for voters out there, and especially for immigrants from places like Puerto Rico who have, you know, the right to vote because they are American citizens, and maybe immigrants not the right word, but people who are leaving Puerto Rico to come here, but have no resources or education for how to tap into those rights. And I know I said lastly, but lastly, before we take a quick break, is we need to do something about Citizens United, right? And all of the dark money that's funding elections. And if you look at a lot of the races that were super competitive, I mean, there are just hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into local races. We've never seen that amount of money before getting spent on media and other costs for those campaigns. It's dark money. That means we don't know where it's coming from. We can't track it. And so it makes it really hard to know who's actually funding these campaigns. You know, because corporations are now treated as people and they're allowed to throw big money at these campaigns, it really shifts the balance of power for regular people who don't have the resources to compete in that way. And so it means that young people, newcomers, and people from third parties are really disenfranchised when they want to step in to a race and compete for the offices that are up for election. And it's the reason why we keep seeing incumbents getting elected year after year, even though they're doing a really bad job. This all relates to campaign finance reform. And so we really need to look at that and look at possibly reversing court rulings like Citizens United to stop that flow of dark money from, permeating all of these races across the country. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to WPPM 106.5 FM, PhillyCAM Community Radio. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. I've been talking with my colleagues, journalists Larry Mcglynn and Denise Clay-Murray, and we are participating in Democracy Day, which is a campaign led by the Center for Cooperative Media and many other partners. And there are journalists and media outlets across the country producing content today, September 15th, to talk about the current threats to democracy and also current threats to journalism. We're going to take a 1-minute break and tell you more about PhillyCAM, our wonderful community media center. And when we come back on our next segments, we'll talk about the threats of white supremacist organizing and disinformation. Stay tuned. We'll be right back in less than a minute. If you're tuning in and you like what you hear, please consider supporting PhillyCAM, Philadelphia's Community Media Center. If you would like to produce media like this show or something else that is of your interest, definitely check out PhillyCAM.org. It is a membership organization available to people in the Philadelphia region who'd like to learn more about community media and take production classes and have access to our platforms on our cable TV channels, our web platforms, and also our FM community radio station. Again, that website is PhillyCAM.org. You can also go to that website to make a donation and support our community-supported station. We need all the help we can get to keep producing content like this. So if you support a local media and independent voices and programs like these, please consider supporting PhillyCAM.org. We're also always looking for interns and volunteers and also have employment opportunities. Again, follow us online on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at PhillyCAM and also on our website at PhillyCAM.org. All right, welcome back. Again, I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. I was making a little PSA for our wonderful community radio station that gives us the access to be able to talk about all of these issues that are so important. When we first started organizing to build this radio station, we wanted to have public affairs programs like these that were not interrupted by commercials, and also where it actually allowed us to talk in depth about these issues. One of the things that constituents, people from the public had told us is that they find that a lot of these important issues are not covered in depth, and they really want like a whole program where they can learn more about some of the things that we're talking about. So for that reason, we bring you a 1 hour program all about democracy and its threats. In the next half hour, we are going to be talking about white supremacist organizing. There is a whole group of people all across the country that has been kind of quietly organizing, although very visible in many respects, especially, with events like what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, and in many other places. But we want to talk about how the rise of some of these actual domestic terrorist groups, these militia groups, and groups based in hate are organizing to infiltrate police, the National Guard. They're infiltrating military. They're also at academic institutions. And now they're also infiltrating elections. Denise told me she was an expert on this subject, so I'm going to pass the mic to Denise to talk more about her thoughts on why this group of people, the white supremacists, pose an imminent threat to our democracy.
Yes, and for those of you who are watching this right now on PhillyCAM, I am Black, which means the fact that I have attended my share of Klan meetings in my career, it was probably going to make you scratch your head a little bit. But let me take you through it. Um, it what you have to understand about white supremacy and white supremacist groups in particular is that racism, like a whole lot of isms, is economic. And economics is how folks are recruited into these groups. Your plant shut down because you don't understand global economics. You believe it when somebody tells you, oh, it's because they brought more immigrants into the area and they're taking your jobs away. So you believe stuff like that. And you also believe people who tell you stuff like that. And that's where we come to democracy, the right to vote, and Donald Trump. When Donald Trump came down his gold escalator from his penthouse in Manhattan, and amazingly enough, got people to believe that he was the common man, one of the ways that he did it is through the use of plain old simple doodah racism, bringing up Mexican people and saying that, these people aren't sending us their best. And he tapped into that segment of the country that would have really liked it if the 1960s and the civil rights movement had never happened. And unfortunately, a lot of these folks are working particularly in smaller towns, particularly here in Pennsylvania, where you have 67 voting systems from 67 different towns. And each of them are run by people who only know enough about voting systems to be dangerous most of the time. They, when you're able to say, you can blame these people for your plight in life, getting them to understand, getting them to think that everything is being stolen from them, especially their president, which is why the big lie, or the fact that you have folks out there who truly believe that all 67 counties in Pennsylvania got together and committed fraud against Donald Trump to keep him from winning Pennsylvania and thus winning the election. That is all a function of the belief that white people are losing And because of that, and the reason why they're losing is because there's treachery being perpetrated against them. And while that is about as true as me getting on here and saying that I am a cardiothoracic surgeon, which I am not, it sticks because when you are already in a mode to believe that you are not being given the treatment that you feel you deserve, you can totally believe that these people are coming to get you and they're meaning to do you harm. And one of the ways they're meaning to do you harm is through the voting booth, which is why all of a sudden you see mail-in voting, which is not a fraudulent thing, being talked about as such. And it doesn't help that the way Pennsylvania's um, vote by mail law is conducted or how it was set up, that doesn't help things, because when you're used to getting election results the night of, and you can't because you're not allowed to start counting mail-in ballots until the day of the election, and that there's just no way you're going to get millions and millions of mail-in ballots counted all in one day. It's another thing that allows people to buy into this kind of stuff. And unfortunately, the way white supremacy is, and particularly white supremacist groups have traditionally conducted themselves, is by the use of violence, which is why you saw people coming to the Pennsylvania Convention Center with a Hummer full of weapons during the count in 2020, which is why you saw the January 6th insurrection, where you had people who at one time were running around talking about Blue Lives Matter, beating the crap out of police officers because they saw them as agents of the state protecting people who didn't deserve it and their votes. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw an uptick in violence as we get closer to the midterm elections, especially if Republicans are losing. Because even though you have like the Doug Mastrianos of the world who are trying to distance themselves from the violence, their rhetoric says something different. And the fact that Mastriano was actually at the January 6th insurrection says something else that's different altogether. But we have to be really, really cognizant of the fact that instead of just using legislation to keep people away from the polls, you have groups that are massing and making plans to use violence to keep you from the polls.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they're employing a lot of different tactics to scare and intimidate people. And one of the things that's so frustrating is how the Department of Justice and other federal law enforcement agencies refuse to elevate this to the level of domestic terrorism, right? Because so many of the events that we've seen associated with mass shootings have been white supremacists, these young white men feeling isolated and disenfranchised and resort to hate and violence, and then mass shootings to enact out their rage, is hit the level of crisis in my belief. And again, there's a number of these militias that are very active. They're heavily armed, and they're open carrying in a lot of these states, right? They're not even trying to hide what they're doing. Instead, they're being very public about who they are and what their intentions are. And if Black people did that, right, or Muslim people did that, or Latinos did that, you would not have that same reaction, right? The police would be out there, people would be arrested, there would be national media attention on these things, and we just don't see it rise to that level when it comes to the white supremacists. And so that is what makes it so scary, right? Is that they're rather unpredictable in a lot of ways, and it doesn't feel like the entities that are supposed to protect us are doing that. And we've even seen here in Philadelphia that there have been police officers with affiliations to white supremacist groups, either by their participation on online groups on Facebook, right? There was a really big investigation that showed dozens and dozens of Philadelphia police officers participating in online hate groups. And also, some of the Nazi tattoos and other symbols that we've seen on them, on their person, walking around in the streets. And yet many of them have not been fired or removed from their positions. That's happening in cities all across the country. So again, I return to that infiltration that we're seeing. And it's like, well, the reason why police and maybe, FBI are not doing anything is because there's already people on the inside preventing that from happening. I want to move to our next topic within the last, 10 or 15 minutes that we have, which is all about disinformation, right? And disinformation is definitely heavily correlated to white supremacist groups because oftentimes when people are feeling some type of economic repression, isolation, depression, anxiety, etc., they find themselves on the internet and they find the dark parts of the internet that has a lot of hate speech and disinformation that actually incites violence. There have been studies on social media platforms that show that the algorithm actually is set to promote engagement with hateful and violent speech. And that is the more that you engage with it, the more you're going to be fed that content. And so a lot of people's extremist views are the result of, internet interactions and content that they've read, which promotes a lot of myths and a lot of hateful ideology. I wanted to ask both you, Larry and Denise, how as journalists, you are combating misinformation and disinformation, especially as it relates to myths like the stolen election, right, which led people to riot and an insurrection and almost like an attempted coup on January 6th. What's the role of journalism in all of this and media literacy? Larry, let's start with you.
So about a year ago, I was watching a Senate hearing, and Senator Rand Paul for Kentucky was lying about Anthony Fauci's record to Fauci, who was there himself, and they were arguing back and forth. And he was and Rand Paul was spreading misinformation. Sitting in that Senate hearing as well was Senator Bob Casey, who we had on the show the next day. And I asked the senator, I said, Senator, how do you, when you have a United States senator and a televised hearing that can be seen all over the country, who's saying things that are untrue, how do you stop that? And he said, by coming here and talking to you. And that's why community media, local media is so important, because I have my gut feeling is that local media is more trusted than national media in a lot of places. And the reason for that is because we know who our audience is, and we know how to speak to our audience and relate things to our audience. And I think it's fundamentally important that if you're going to be a journalist and you want to be able to do these things, you have to get to know who your audience is and spend time with them in their communities. And it takes a lot of work. And that's why I think to a certain extent on our end, we have to be doing more work in order to build that trust and build those bridges. But the discouraging thing about it is sometimes all that work can be almost destroyed by one person in a high position saying something unfounded. But you have to keep plugging away at it and keep going at it and earning that trust and telling people the truth and the things that they're not hearing from other places. Even other well-meaning organizations don't tell people the whole truth, especially when we're talking about, consuming news in 30-second or minute sound bites. That doesn't always, help people out and give people the full story. So you have to do a good job of getting that information to people in a trusted way.
Yeah, part of restoring trust with journalists, right, and media in general is spending time in the communities. That's a big complaint that we have, a critique we often have of commercial mainstream media reporters is that they're not from our communities. They don't know our stories. They don't understand the nuances about our community. And even if they are maybe doing a good job of reporting, there's still that distrust. And so, it is important to build trust with the community that you're serving, um, so that they look to you as a source of credible information. And relationship building is a huge part of that. But then, as Larry mentioned, you actually have to do the work of putting out factual, truthful information, and making sure that everything is verifiable, even though that sometimes requires a lot of extra work. Denise, I'd love to hear from you about your thoughts on the role of journalism and journalists in combating disinformation.
Well, for one thing, and this is probably going to make every journalist that's listening to this like run screaming from the room and pull their hair out. It's time for us to abandon objectivity as a means of doing news. Because
Absolutely right.
sometimes when we say, oh, well, we have to give both sides equal weight, no, you don't. It is your job to tell the truth. And if one side is blatantly lying, you have to point that out. You can't just say, oh, well, we're going to give them the chance to say what they're going to say. And then we'll hope that when we give you the truth, you'll actually listen to us and understand it later. Because that is not how this works. I had a professor at Temple University tell me that the reason why he would not allow you to make up an assignment that you got a factual error on was because the error went out on page 1, but the correction is in a little box about this big on page 2 that nobody reads generally. You've got to get it right the first time, which means if somebody is blatantly lying and you have proof that they are lying, you've got to say it. And we're getting a little further away from objectivity now. And I'm not saying that objectivity is necessarily bad. There are places where you can be objective when both groups of people kind of have an idea of what truth actually is. But that is not always the case anymore, not particularly when you cover politics. You've got people out there who know they're lying, to the community, and they do it anyway. And I think it's our responsibility as journalists to say, no, we're not going to let you continue to do that. You are lying. And most importantly, you are lying to the public, and we can't let you do that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people are actually objective in general, right? Like, um, when that concept was first created, it was created by white men at a time when mostly white men controlled all newsrooms, right? Like women weren't allowed to report on the news. Certainly, communities of color were not integrated at that time. I mean, very few had their own media outlets. But, I find it hard to believe that um, any one of us can completely abandon who we are and even like the way that we approach sources, right? Um, I don't think anything is objective, right? The language that we choose to describe something, the people who we choose to interview, the way that we interpret information, it's all subjective because we're human beings and we bring our own experiences to things. I do think, though, we have a duty, as Denise said, to tell the truth, to fact check, to verify all information. We can interview people and find that they're lying, and we don't have to feature them, right? Just because you interview somebody and they give you a statement doesn't mean that they have to be included on your platform. I certainly wouldn't want to have somebody here as this part of the conversation spouting utter nonsense and lying, right? Or also espousing racist or hateful points of view. Um, there really isn't freedom of speech in that sense, right? Because we don't want liars on the air. We don't want people misleading the public. We don't want misinformation. And I agree, as journalists, it's our job to hold power to account and to show when there is corruption and when these systems are failing the public. And so objectivity is also a very Western capitalist media idea for journalism. If you go to other countries, like I said, I've traveled quite a bit abroad doing research about media and journalism with people from different countries. And, especially when you go to areas where there's conflict or post-war, or you're in the middle of a war, objectivity is always hard to find, right? Especially if there's an aggressor that's literally killing people or committing genocide. How do you remain completely objective in those situations? We're seeing disinformation and misinformation play out now. Like, speaking of conflicts with Ukraine and Russia, it's very hard to ascertain what's happening there, right? And because, we are not there, it's difficult to know whether or not, each government in both countries is telling the truth. That's why it's important to have foreign correspondents on the ground interviewing people, showing the evidence so that we can understand what's happening. But lastly, I just want to say that, the responsibility ultimately falls on you, the listener, right? The public. You have to educate yourself about being media literate and learning how to evaluate different types of information and to look to a variety of different sources in order to find the truth. Especially with international news, it's very important to look outside of U.S. media and look and see how other countries are reporting on the same subject. And to that end, a vibrant community and independent media, right, free of corporate control and advertisements, is also really critical into finding the truth, because we don't often have a lot of the meddling, we'll say, and manipulation that comes from high levels of corporate media in terms of how to frame different subjects. We only have a couple minutes left. I want to thank both of my guests for appearing on this program. Final thoughts from Denise and Denise. Let's try that again. Final thoughts from Denise and Larry about how to save our democracy. Denise, we'll go to you first.
Well, probably the best way I could suggest that we save our democracy is become more of a consumer of news and exercise your right to vote.
Thank you. Larry, what are your thoughts?
Same thing. Just be an educated consumer of news, and you have to vote, and you have to be educated when you go to vote, so you know what you're voting for.
I agree with both of those things, but I also say talk to your neighbor. We've lost a lot of the social fabric that made our country really educated and collaborative and in the spirit of mutual aid and solidarity. You can find so much by leaving your house and being in community and talking with folks and having these really robust conversations and debates. I think that's where we're truly educated, hearing other points of view, talking with people, learning about their experience, and learning how some of these policies directly impact other people outside of yourself. So don't just vote, don't just educate yourself on all the issues and become media literate, but support institutions like PhillyCAM and shows like Hall Monitor and stations like WPPM, who are bringing you this really valuable civic information that's going to help you navigate the world around you and hopefully get you to participate and save democracy. Thanks again to Allison Durham, who's engineering over on the other part of the studio, and everyone here at PhillyCAM for supporting this work. You can find more about WPPM and PhillyCAM by going on our website at phillycam.org, and you can learn about other Democracy Day shows and join the conversation by following the hashtag Democracy Day. That's all for today. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. Thank you so much for watching and listening. You're listening to WPPM LP in Philadelphia, 106.5 FM.